Okay, so on this evidences video, I want to talk about the Book of Abraham. I did another video talking about how critics attack the Book of Abraham, and I also want to address there's some fascinating evidences that we have also of the Book of Abraham. So, and I love this quote from Elder Maxwell in his book, Plain and Precious Things. He says, it's the author's opinion that all the scriptures, including the Book of Mormon, will remain in the realm of faith. Science will not be able to prove or disprove Holy Writ. However, enough plausible evidence will come forth to prevent scoffers from having a field day, but not enough to remove the requirement of faith. Believers must be patient during such unfolding. So these videos are Cliff Notes versions, so I'm going to give you a sampling of a lot of great stuff that's out there, and I'll put lots of links in the show notes so that you can see as much as you'd like to explore on this. So first of all, this is on the church website, the Gospel Topics Essay on the Book of Abraham. Egyptians at the time of Abraham actually were thought of until just in the last few decades as a very peaceful people, were not involved in human sacrifice. That's interesting. Here it says, the Book of Abraham speaks disapprovingly of human sacrifice offered on an altar in Chaldea. Some victims were placed on the altar as sacrifices because they rejected the idols worshipped by the leaders. Recent scholarship has found instances of such punishment dating to Abraham's time. People who challenged the standing religious order, either in Egypt or in the regions over which it had influence, such as Canaan, could and did suffer execution for their offenses. The conflict over the religion of Pharaohs, described in Abraham 1, 11, and 12, is an example of punishment now known to have been meted out during the Abrahamic era. And this is just in the last few decades, I have to say. This one is stunning. So if you look closely at this picture, the facsimile one, which Joseph interpreted as Abraham on a lion couch, critics say this was Osiris on a lion couch, nothing to do with Abraham. And it's very fascinating to find that this was discovered in 1975. And it's from the same time and place that the papyri were found in Thebes, Egypt. That same general time frame as well. So it's 1975, Janet Johnson translated and published a newly discovered Greco-Egyptian vignette depicting an individual on a lion couch identified in the text to be Abraham. You can see it right on the picture there where it identifies the man on the lion couch as Abraham. Stunning. The papyrus known as Leiden 1, 384 was produced just 2 centuries after the Book of Breathings and in the same part of Egypt, Thebes, where the scrolls were found. Fascinating. Okay, ancient texts verify attempt to kill Abraham for not worshiping idols. This was translated in 1892 from Aramaic to English, the Targum Jonathan, which is dated to the 2nd century A.D. Here's a quote. It came to pass when Nimrod cast Abram into the furnace of fire because he would not worship his idol. The fire had no power to burn him. Kind of fascinating. 1892 translation. The next one here. Abraham ended human sacrifice as claimed in the Book of Abraham. Something fundamentally changed in relation to man's attitude toward human sacrifice, together with the elaboration of the notion that it could be replaced by animal sacrifice. Just when and why this change took place cannot be answered satisfactorily in Egypt or elsewhere. Our strongest textual evidence that something had indeed changed in Egypt dates to the Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2055 BC, which is about the time of Abraham. So another one here, the Book of Abraham speaks of the plain of Olishem, Abraham 1:10. It's a name not mentioned in the Bible. An ancient inscription was found recently, dated to 2250 BC, and it was discovered in the 20th century. It mentions a town called Ulisem. Sounds very close to Olishem. Phonographically in the language, it's almost exact, and it's located in northern Syria, which is where most scholars today believe that Abraham's Ur was most likely located. That's on the Gospel Topics Essay there for the church. Okay, now many scholars thought Abraham was illiterate, and now we see a number of books that have been attributed to Abraham. So many books written by or about Abraham have been discovered. The Book of Abraham claims Abraham wrote books, even though this detail is not found in the Bible or anything Joseph Smith had access to. Archaeologists once thought Abraham was not literate, but now archaeologists have found many books that claim to have been written by Abraham. Apocalypse of Abraham, Testament of Abraham, Book of Jashar, Jubilees, 10 Books of Abraham, Book of Abraham mentioned by Firmicus Maternus, and Abraham's Treatise on Astronomy. Okay, on the church website, Gospel Topics Essay on the Book of Abraham, in the facsimile 1, you can see here 117 mentions the idolatrous god Elkanah. This deity is not mentioned in the Bible, yet modern scholars have identified it as being among the gods worshipped by ancient Mesopotamians. Also, let me take a minute on this picture here, too. These were considered funerary texts that were part of the book of breathings that would be deposited with these. And this is not a typical funerary text at all. Normally they'd be an embalming scene, and they would either be naked or fully wrapped up, mummified, if you will. You can see here that neither of that applies. Some have said this is Osiris being resurrected, but if you look close, it's actually, look at the legs. There's a struggle going on here, and actually look at the hands. This is also a form. If you were to tilt it 90 degrees, it would be the exact replication of how they would have drawn prayer, supplication to deity. There. So very fascinating with how we understand this from Joseph Smith's interpretation of all of that in Abraham 1. So next here, if you look on the Gospel Topics essay as well, they talk about this. On facsimile 2, if you look closely at that, the bottom left, you'll see 4 hanging pieces there. It's labeled as figure 6. And these represent the earth in its 4 quarters, as Joseph wrote. A similar interpretation has been argued by scholars who study identical figures in other ancient Egyptian texts. Okay, next, Joseph Smith's interpretation of Pharaohs, that symbol correct. Here, this crocodile. And this is again in facsimile 1 at the bottom, which this is not typically drawn on these scenes like this, but is referred to as a crocodile god. King Unas of Egypt is referred to as the crocodile god in the Egyptian text. Joseph Smith likewise interpreted the crocodile god in facsimile 1 as god of Pharaoh. Utterance 3:17 says, Unas has come today from the overflowing flood. Unas is Sobek, crocodile god. Clean, green-plumed, wakeful, alert. Unas has come to his streams. And if you look closely at that picture too, those lines, the way that they're drawn there, is that the kind of the zigzag reference waters of the sky in ancient Egyptian literature, which the ancient Egyptians conceived the sky as a heavenly ocean. Joseph Smith interpreted the symbol very correctly. There's no way he could have known about that symbolism at that time. And also he talked about the pillars of heaven right underneath those, that number 11 there, which was also a correct interpretation. Okay, also discovered after the death of Joseph Smith, a key part of this, and Bruce Porter brought this up in his book, The Threshing Floor of Faith. Two texts are found in Volume 1 of the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, one being the Testament of Abraham, considered an Egyptian text in origin, and the other being the Apocalypse of Abraham. Each of these texts, unavailable to Joseph Smith, have many of the same concepts: the creation, Abraham seeking further light and knowledge from God, the blessings of the fathers, angels taking him away as depicted in the facsimile 1 explanation, discussions of spirits before the world was created. Some spirits were more prepared to become the leaders on earth after the creation of the earth. Be fascinating. Okay, Gospel Topics essay also mentions 2 things here. The Book of Abraham is consistent with various details found in non-biblical stories about Abraham that circulated in the ancient world around the time that the papyri was likely created. In the Book of Abraham, God teaches Abraham about the sun, the moon, and the stars. I show these things unto thee before you go into Egypt, the Lord says, that you may declare all these words. Ancient texts repeatedly refer to Abraham instructing the Egyptians in the knowledge of the heavens. For example, Eupolemus, who lived under the Egyptian rule in the 2nd century BC, wrote that Abraham taught astronomy and other sciences to the Egyptian priests. In the second paragraph here, other details in the Book of Abraham are found in ancient traditions located across the Near East. These include Terah, Abraham's father, being an idolater, a famine striking Abraham's homeland, Abraham's familiarity with Egyptian idols, and Abraham's being younger than 75 years old when he left Haran, as the biblical account states. Some of these extra-biblical elements were available in apocryphal books or biblical commentaries in Joseph Smith's lifetime, but others were confined to non-biblical traditions inaccessible or unknown to 19th century Americans. Okay, the Book of Abraham reports. Now, this was Daniel Peterson in the Deseret News, a piece. He said, in 2012, Defending the Faith, How Could Joseph Know All This? So the book of Abraham records that as Abraham was about to enter Egypt, the Lord advised him to claim that Sarai was his sister, not his wife. The Bible mentions the same tactic, but omits the divine counsel that authorized it. However, the Genesis Apocryphon, found just 7 decades ago among the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, also testifies that the patriarch's behavior was divinely ordained. And with good reason. The pyramid text tyrannical crocodile god/king liked to steal wives from their husbands, exactly what Abraham feared Pharaoh would do to Sarai. Daniel Peterson went on to say, Abraham's account describes creation as the organization of pre-existing materials, which contradicts traditional doctrines that God made the universe from nothing, we call it ex nihilo. But creation from nothing doesn't appear in the Bible. Ancient Jewish writings teach that God created the universe by forming pre-existing matter. Christian thinkers influenced by Greek philosophy began to teach creation from nothing only in the 2nd century. And then Abraham 4 and 5 records the patriarch's vision of creation unknown in the Bible. And though the Bible says nothing of a heavenly council that planned the creation of man, several ancient documents, first published in the 20th century, describe it. And I would just refer you also to the pre-existence video that I did, an entire video on that. And this is where we get the strongest development of that doctrine of the pre-existence is in Abraham 3 there. And then the very last thing here, and I'm not going to read this, it's somewhat lengthy, but I will read just the caption at the top, and then if you want to freeze the screens to see there's about 15 things here, but Jeff Lindsay put this together on his website, and I'll link it in the show notes. But he says, the Book of Abraham is remarkably consistent with numerous ancient traditions about Abraham, as one might expect if, in fact, it derived from the ancient writings of Abraham. One of many interesting examples is the ancient Jewish text Jubilees, first published in Latin in 1861, but dating to the 2nd century BC or earlier, and used by some of the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In Jubilees, here are some relationship to the Book of Abraham. So I hope you enjoyed this evidences video. I think it's exciting to see a lot of the things like we talked about. Elder Maxwell said at the beginning that enough to thwart away any scoffers of the Book of Abraham. I think it's fascinating to see all of these types of little evidences that are out there as well. Watch the other Book of Abraham video where I address a lot of the critics' issues of it. And together, I think it's a magnificent view of everything. Thank you.